Thank you everyone for coming tonight. Really appreciate you coming to listen to this lecture. It's kind of a trick. This is actually two things tonight. We're going to talk with you about the history of moving buildings at the House of Seven Gables and our campus. Also a little bit about just sort of how it's done and how it was historically done. But we'll also be talking a bit about a future project that we have that's very much coming down the line. We conducted our climate adaptation plan at the end of, or the middle of 2024, and we're actually working to make some of that happen. So we kind of want to put in context the idea of doing that work for you. And we thought that people might be really interested to hear that history as well alongside it. I can hand it over to David, but I think we're just going to be talking back and forth.
Yeah. So to start out, I want to do a little bit of a sort of goofus and gallon of how not to move a house. And so here we have Buster Keaton in 1920 in the classic film 1 Week, in which he and his newlywed wife try and build a kit house and then find out they built on the wrong lot, so they need to move it.
Buster Keaton has the best.
Today they would have called Morgan and Morgan.
Too special.
It's so funny. Jesus. Oh my God.
Very nice.
That's a hard act to follow.
We've done all our research, and our plan is to not do it that way.
Yeah, right. Check the railroad schedules.
But I thought I would start it off by just sharing. So this is a photo from George Noyes. Date not totally uncertain, but late 1800s, early 1900s possibly. And it shows a fairly simple process at a time when buildings being moved was fairly common. David, you just gave a really astounding statistic from the HSI Relocation database.
So 384 houses were moved in Salem with the records that go from 1875 until 1975. So that's 3.8 houses a year. And some years like 1883 and 1902, both of those years saw 16 houses move around Salem. So it was very common. And in the pre-industrial days into the later 1800s, you see mostly horse and ox power used to move these houses. Nowadays, we don't spend a lot of time around oxen, but if you see one, they're huge. They can really pull a lot of weight, and the larger horses too.
It was easier to move these houses before power lines were built, isn't that part of?
Yeah, and in the more modern period, the moving and removing of power lines, whether lifting them up or cutting them down, is a big part of.
But it wasn't not an issue at all.
Yeah.
In fact, that's what this person on that roof is doing. Is apparently lifting power lines out of the way.
Yeah.
Maybe cable lines, but. So it was a fairly common occurrence. So it could be done as simply as jacking up a building, putting it on a cart, and towing it with a team of oxen. Wow. Again, a fairly simple frame structure where the risks were pretty minimal. But then it can be I think we kind of switched it around
Yeah.
a little bit. So, and that can be facilitated through a couple of different ways, even for this more simple of moving there. But yeah.
Did we lose that?
No, I just put it past. So, or the much more elaborate moving of a 6-story masonry building, which would be done a completely different way. And so in urban centers where streets are being widened or lots being rearranged.
Where's this structure?
Oh my gosh, I forgot.
Okay, no,
It's in
never
Boston.
mind.
It's a hotel in Boston.
Okay.
But it's gone now. So they spent all this. It was on Tremont Street. They were moving it because Tremont Street was being widened. So they put through all this expense to move it, and then I believe it was something like 30 or 40 years after it was demolished.
It's a beautiful building.
But I'm gonna kind of go back, kind of talk about the different methods. So we have here, this is an illustration from an 1873 agricultural journal, teaching your average farmer husbandry and yeoman for how to move a building. And it just very simply illustrates how to build a carriage for putting up the house on, using screw jacks to raise it up, and then pulling it up along. These are actual timbers that it was going to be pulled along. And then it shows the horse team pulling it. Often using other means of pulling it rather than just straight pulling it with the horse. There's usually a pulley involved or a capstan of some sort.
And the point that it makes is you're putting a screw jack at each of the corners of the house, or more than that if the sill that holds the house, like the layer of beams that the house frame sits on, if that's particularly weak or fragile, you got to add more screw jacks. And they all have to either be turned simultaneously by a big crew or moved about an inch or two at a time in sync, so you're not cracking the plaster and doing damage to the house, making sure that it's being raised symmetrically.
So what happens to the foundation of the house after you move it?
They either remove it or build a new house on it, and they have to build a new foundation where it's going unless there was a pre-existing foundation.
So this shows two guys turning the screw jacks.
A
So
lot of
in
times
that case,
the foundations were so inadequate, they were collapsing, and
it might not be seen worthwhile.
so there was not much worth.
Okay.
And so then talking about methods of moving it, so I showed you this sort of timber that it could be pulled on, but then these are roller logs. So they could also be for simpler structure, or this is what you had access to rather than timbers. They would just be rolled on logs, moving from one log to the next. You would take the last one and put it in front of the building and over and on again to repeat the process. These are actually ones that I found online. They were for sale. They were used by a building mover. These were cut down in 1880. 1880, it says circa 80. And then it was used in Seattle, specifically used when they were moving a lot of buildings when they were raising the grade around Seattle.
You know what the dimensions were?
These were small. These were about 6 inches in diameter.
Yeah.
So these were probably used on a smaller building rather than a full-size house.
But then some more elaborate buildings required more elaborate plans for moving. And so this is actually a diagram from an engineer from Britain who came and visited America, and he was very astonished to sort of remark on, the tradition of moving buildings, and it was a tradition because it's something that had been done long before he had visited at this time to doing this journey. This was actually in New York City. It was a 4-story house, brick row house that was being moved because, again, streets were being widened. The grid in New York was being laid out more rigidly. So he stayed as he was kind of doing his assessment of America and reporting back home about how they moved this building. And so this building was only being moved maybe a dozen feet or so. So it wasn't being moved a ton, but it needed to be moved more carefully because masonry structures require a more careful process of doing it. You can't have an ox team which is going to be pulling at uneven rates, creating a jerking movement that could cause things to topple. So they used basically the screw jacks horizontally. So you can see over here, basically they have this structure that is built as sort of a sled and then they put the sled on top of this platform. So this is the rail, and the sled sits on top. They attach the screw jack to the platform and then push against it. But they'd be using a lot of screw jacks, turning them very slowly, very carefully in unison. Now, in this case, you wouldn't have one or two people going to each one turning at a time. They'd be turning it together. And that is what allows you to move incredibly large structures like that at that time. So this was, late 1800s. This is illustrating, early 1800s. Oh, I jumped ahead another thing. So early 1800s. And I also wanted to make one other note from that same engineer. His name is David Stevenson. And he made, I think, a pretty strong observation about why building moving was such a tradition. He noted that the lowest wages in the US for laborers is 4 shillings and 2 pence. And in Britain is 2 shillings, which was basically the wages in the US was double.
Wow.
So the cost to build in the United States has always been, or at least at that time and up until, maybe even still today, much larger than it was cost over in Europe, back home in England. So the impetus was to, rather than tear down and build new, all that work that went into a building, finishing, framing, resource extraction, needed to be preserved. In a sense, you could say this is a very environmental practice. It's really an economical practice, but it's one that we don't really have as ingrained today, but maybe one that we want to begin considering again. Because the value of that labor is it's embedded into all those different materials is extremely important. We talk about embedded carbon when you're talking about sustainability. So embodied labor is another form of that kind of same practice. And this is another great kind of illustration. So this is actually a house being let down a hill. So you can see the animals that are helping let it down. They have a capstan, which is basically a pivot or a wheel that allows them to control the movement by working around this anchor point. And you can see they also have a block and tackle pulley helping reduce. So a lot of engineering behind these practices, and then they have sort of blocks to keep that from cascading down the hill as well.
A lot of simple machines, levers, pulleys.
Yeah.
And when it comes to the history of house moving, we know it's a long tradition in New England, going back to the very first English-style house, which was built in Massachusetts, which was built by the Merchant Adventurers Company around 1623 in what's today Gloucester. And then that company fell apart, and Roger Conant took a group of them to settle what is now Salem in Nomkeg. And when Governor John Endicott arrived in 1628, he wanted what was left of that house removed from Gloucester and brought to Salem. And so it was at least partly dismantled and brought from Gloucester to Salem in 1628. What the source says is shook and brought hither. And when Francis Higginson arrives in Salem in 1629, he notes that there are about a half score of houses and a fair house newly built for the governor. But in fact, we know it was brought and reconstructed there from down in Gloucester. And it's not without its perils. Maybe some of you in Salem, I see Josie nodding her head from the cemetery.
It's like my favorite.
We know this
stone.
guy, Nathaniel Richardson, sort of a cursed family, the Richardsons, because his grandson dies in a horrible accident. His son ruins his business and commits suicide in 1811. But before all of that, back in 1796, this is his probate. He was a pretty wealthy merchant and a tanner. He owned the largest tannery in Essex County. And what Reverend William Bentley records in his diary for January of 1796, he says, just before 6 o'clock, a melancholy accident happened at the corner of Daniel Street, which for those who don't know is just a few blocks from here, occasioned by a building removing towards Derby Street from Essex Street. Mr. Nathaniel Richardson, Upon turning the corner, took the charge of his own oxen, and as the building slid towards the fence, the shoe caught his greatcoat, and before it could be known, he was thrown down, and his head passed between an open joist of the building and some timber piled against the fence, and it was instant death. And he says that the timber was covered in snow, so nobody knew that it was there. And then on his tombstone, they actually wrote, his death was instant from the pressure of a building he was assisting to remove. And so here you have a very stark reminder of the dangers that could be attended on moving houses. And then the last example I want to talk about, just as a sort of precursor, is another example from Reverend Bentley's diary. And this is a little later, from May of 1818. This is the Mason Roberts Colby Nichols house, which federal court runs just to the left of it. This is Federal Street that it fronts on. And it had been built along the Salem Common, where the John Bertram home is today, on the corner of Mall Street and Washington Square. And what Bentley writes in his diary is, we have been amused, not to say affronted, by the attempt to convey through our streets from Washington Square to Federal Street a house of 3 stories from Mason's lot. The smaller parts had been sent on. The main house was dragged into the street and stood for 1 week. Yesterday, it passed St. Peter's Church. The pumps were removed and the cornerstone, and after a day's work with a team of above 30 pair of oxen and their proper drivers, and with screws, chains, and cables, I saw it turned. The operations did no honor to their judgment. There was no supreme command, and the streets were injured in a most shameful manner. The experience of so much trouble, loss, and confusion should open the eyes of the citizens. So this was his diary. He was not holding back his feelings about, and he lived just around the corner on the other side of the common, so he probably walked out of his front door every day and saw this house sitting in the street for a week. And if you walk by it today, it does say on the plaque from Historic Salem that it was moved by 60 oxen in 1818. And so we have a couple motivations in the early 20th century as the House of the Seven Gables is becoming a museum for why buildings are being moved. Beyond just the economic considerations, you start having an interest in building preservation. And so here's an example of a house on Washington Street, which stood right next to our Hooper Hathaway house in the process of its demolition in 1911. And so you can see at that point, if you look at any map of Salem, all the parking lots, a lot of that was all building before the early 20th century, before the introduction of automobiles. Salem has about the same population today as it did in 1910, but it's far less dense because all along Highland and Jefferson, that's all been settled, where there weren't houses before the early 20th century. And so as they're building this incredibly dense city, and then they're trying to adapt for automobiles, and then later in the 20th century, you get urban renewal. There's a lot of houses being torn down for a variety of reasons, and antiquarians and historians start wanting to step in and preserve them. And here's a postcard from Greenfield Village in Michigan, which was begun by Henry Ford. And the idea here was he was saving houses from Connecticut and Massachusetts and Florida and moving them to a museum campus in Dearborn, Michigan. And it's an example of what's sometimes called an architectural petting zoo, where they're bringing these buildings together. It's a process that starts in Stockholm in about 1890 with a place called Wisconsin, which is a mix of an amusement park, a zoo, and a folk museum. And I believe the first example in the United States of that sort of open-air museum is right here at the House of the Seven Gables. When the Hooper Hathaway house is brought here in 1911, it creates this idea of, okay, let's move houses together to create this village atmosphere and preserve building which otherwise may be destroyed. Do you have anything you want
I was
to
going to
say?
say, no, we should have asked people to guess what they thought what the first open-air museum was. 'Cause I feel like a lot of people would maybe think like Plymouth.
When did Ford initiate Dearborn?
It was late 1920s, early 1930s. I forget the exact year.
Okay, I don't,
Yeah.
I agree with that, I just don't have the specific date
Yeah.
either.
Yeah, because Edison was still alive and helped facilitate the moving of his laboratory from New Jersey to Dearborn to be part of the museum. it was really quite an undertaking. If you've never been, it's a really interesting museum, just also for the history of museums themselves. And let's talk a little bit about our campus. So in 1910, the museum opens. April of 1910 is when it opens its doors to the public, preserving the Turner Ingersoll mansion, this house from 1668. And then almost immediately, within the next year, the Hooper Hathaway house is saved and brought to our property. And you can see a photograph here, but it's on its original location. There are actually a good number of photographs of it because it had become a local landmark called the Old Bakery by the beginning of the 20th century. It's a house that was built in 1682 by a man named Benjamin Hooper, his wife Eleanor. She was an indentured servant from Jersey. He was a shoemaker. In the 1750s, another wing of the house was added by his grandson, and it became a bakery only in the 1860s. So fairly late into its history. The Hoopers left the house in 1795, was the last of the Hoopers who lived there. And so it becomes this landmark, this antiquarian house right in downtown. The railroad line ran right down Washington Street in front of it. And so a lot of postcards of it were sold at the time. And it was going to be demolished. We saw that house, which stood, so the Hooper Hathaway house was just behind this house, which belonged to the Rust family on the corner of Federal Street. And so they were going to tear it down to build the Cohen Brothers Entertainment Complex. Cohen with a K. These are these two brothers, John and William Cohen, who, starting in 1908, had owned a number of movie theaters in Salem. Salem was becoming sort of the entertainment hub of the North Shore with a number of movie theaters. And so this whole block was slated for demolition. And 1910 is when the Society for the Preservation of New England Antiquities, what's now called Historic New England, was formed. Caroline Emerton was one of the founding board members of that, along with its president, William Sumner Appleton. And the Society for the Preservation of New England Antiquities was interested in saving this house. The story goes that Appleton put up money for it that he didn't have, and was sort of tearing his hair out walking around downtown Salem when he ran into Caroline Emerton. And she said, okay, I'll pay for it and we'll move it to the house of the Seven Gables campus. And so they brought it here in July of 1911. They purchased it in June. They had an alderman's meeting. This was back when Salem had a council of aldermen rather than a city council, because a lot of neighbors were concerned that this house was too tall. It was over 18 feet tall, so you couldn't move it within the fire zone of Salem because it's a wooden house. And it came from Washington down Bridge and then down Webb to Derby Street, most likely on the streetcar rails that already existed there. And it's so tall that it brought all the elm trees, all the boughs of the elm trees that lined Webb Street especially, with it along to its final destination here on Derby Street. And so Caroline Emerton in her Chronicle of Three Old Houses said it looked like Burnham Wood from Macbeth. So all these trees brought as an artificial forest to the house of the Seven Gables. Is there anything you'd like to add?
The other thing I was going to add real quick is that the Essex Institute was also considering purchasing it. I don't know how seriously, but the entire of the Essex Institute's property lay within the fire district. So they would have also, so apparently the city let them move a wooden structure over 18 feet, but the Gables was outside of the fire district, so that may have seemed more preferable to them than to move it within the fire district.
So where was the house on Washington Street?
So it was 21 or 23 Washington in the 19th century. So right now the Museum of Torture sits right there. So if you know that condominium building that's right at the end of Washington as you're Bridge Street is just at the end of the block there. So that cross where the train station is today. And it was moved in 3 pieces over the course of 9 or 10 days. In 1911, and then they restored it and opened it up to the public. And so in 1912 they had put in colonial furniture, recreated diamond paned windows, and used the upper floors and some of the space for classrooms for the settlement house that Caroline Emerton was using. So in addition to preserving this landmark house, she was able to use it for the social settlement that she was funding with the museum.
So David, would that have been in the fire zone in 1914? Would it have burned?
It wouldn't. So
It
the
wasn't?
fire, the fire didn't come quite as far
Okay.
as there.
Okay.
But that is a good point. And you see right after the fire a huge wave of house movings and building in Salem.
I should also specify, so the fire zone was the district that the city had basically set aside, or not set aside, but zoned as a particular concern for fire threat. This is actually before the Great Salem Fire of 1914, which happens and doesn't really hit the fire zone. It kind of wraps around it. So.
And there's another building which no longer exists called the Siemens Bethel, or it was rechristened Turner Hall, which stood on the front lawn of the House of the Seven Gables. So you can see the mansion right there, and the waterfront, the seawall, is just at the bottom of this photograph. And this was built in 1890 for the Young Men's Siemens Bethel Association, which there was a ship captain named Henry Barr who died in 1836. He'd made a fortune from the pepper trade and the East Indies trade, and he left a bequest in his will that his daughter, when she passed away, should create a church for sailors in Salem. And between 1836 and the late 1880s, the maritime trade in Salem had collapsed. There weren't really a lot of sailors left, so it stood empty for most of its history from 1890 until it was used by the Salem YMCA in 1908 as the initial location for Salem Settlement House that Caroline Emerton ran. Almost as soon as they move in here, she purchases the House of the Seven Gables to raise the funds to support that settlement work taking place in the Bethel. And in 1914, so 4 years after the museum opened, they moved the house down Turner Street to behind the mansion. So it would have sat not far from where we are right now within our visitor center. And it was expanded. You can see where they added on a kitchenette and some classrooms on the southern side of the house. And it stood there and was used for the settlement up until 1966.
Okay.
Anything you want to add? Or?
What was the demise?
So, this relates to a couple incidents happening on the campus. In 1966, along Hardy Street, where we have a parking lot next to the yellow Phippen house, between Phippen and the Hawthorne birthplace, was a mansard roof 19th century house called the Roll House, which the House of the Seven Gables used as a bed and breakfast from about the 30s, I believe, up until the 60s. And in 1966, it burned catastrophically. It was completely lost. And that really spooked the Settlement Association that a house was burned so close to its really valuable historic assets. And so they deemed this to be a fire trap and had it pulled down pretty quickly afterwards. It's right in the aftermath of that sprinklers are put into the House of the Seven Gables. And we'll see a couple other sort of changes happen to the site because of that.
What's
but-
the bell?
oh.
What's the bell that was in there?
Yes.
Is that the one that was moved to the condominiums over here now?
Yes, and then that bell was moved to our lawn when in about 2016 those condominiums were sold. So if you visit the lawn of the House of the Seven Gables, you'll see that 1890 bell from the Siemens Bethel.
So what happens at a house to the right?
This one, yeah, I don't know what the fate of that house was. This is the Bowditch house, which is still standing in our parking lot just beside that. But most of these houses were torn down in the 1950s through the 90s, which became our parking lot, where a lot of these sort of triple deckers and double deckers from the 19th century.
One of those houses in that area is 24 and a half Hardy Street.
Yes, yeah.
Nobody's house is in the back.
This might be the one that moved. So this one actually might be the one that's now on Hardy Street. Yeah.
Check the historic HSI relocation database. You want to run that.
And before that fire, before all that stuff, back in 1924, the second house was brought to our site which is called the retired Beckett House by the museum.
Right.
It was built by the Beckett family, who were shipbuilders. It stood just a little to the east of the Gables. So this is today Derby Street. You can see Beckett Court, which is today called Beckett Ave.
Right.
And there's, today this is Blaney Street where the wharf is for the ferry.
Yep.
And over here is Phillips Wharf. So this is all now the lawn that's beside the power plant. So this was all removed prior to 1948 when that power plant was built. But this is an 1874 map showing the Beckett House in its original location on what had become Phillips Wharf and the Marine Railway, which was the main hub for unloading coal into Salem for the railroads in the late 19th century. And so that's why that house occasioned removal. And it was in 1916 that Caroline Emerton purchased it at the advice of SPNEA, the Society for the Preservation of New England Antiquities. And you can see in this photograph, it is already up on its cribbing, getting ready to move in 1924. And they moved it over the course of 4 days. It took a day to move it about 2 blocks down Derby Street. And it was really just a quarter or a third of the original house, which had been built in the 1600s. The section that we have is from 1687, based on some dendrochronology we did recently. But it was basically when retired Beckett, the shipbuilder, died in 1831, 3 of his sisters each inherited a third of the house. One tore down the lean-to in the back, the other sold to the Phillips family, and they tore down the eastern side of the house and built a warehouse right up against it. And so what was left was the original western side of the house, which dates to 1687. And when that was moved here to the site, they built an archway to connect it with the barn in which the tea room was. And they used it, this is pre-restoration, and this is the rear room of our gift shop in the Beckett House, which was an extension of the tea room. They called this the Napoleon room in the early 1920s, and the front part of it was used as an antique store. And so it's been essentially our gift shop since it moved here in 1924. It's still the function it has today. Anything you want to add? And so the last addition to our site is the Hawthorne birthplace, which stood on Union Street. So where this is today, about where the front door is the back fence of a house and a backyard. And then the southern side of it is that dirt parking lot that's in between Herbert and Union Street.
Right.
And so this house was owned by a family named the Whites from the 1870s until they died in about 1957. It was left to the Archdiocese of Boston because the Immaculate Conception Church is just on the other side of Union Street, like the parsonage there. And so the church sold it to the House of the Seven Gables for $1 on the condition that it be removed. And there's a great story that in that year or so that it was left abandoned or vacant at least, that one of the people who lived on that street, a young Peter LaChapelle, who some of you may know, would go and play in it, and his mother told him if he played in that house, they'd take it away. And then he woke up one morning, lo and behold. And so the process of doing that, you can see they took the rear off of it to fit it down Union Street, and they had to move it north to Essex, then around Hawthorne Boulevard to Derby, rather than make the really sharp turn at the bottom of Essex Street. And do you want to talk a little bit about the technical aspects?
So they cleaved off the back
Yeah.
quarter?
Yeah.
Quarter
Third, roughly, yeah.
Why not?
Yeah, well, you know, they had some tight turns to make and they needed to make room for it.
Can you go back to when it was on?
Yeah.
So what part did they take off?
Just the rear section here,
Okay.
you can see that basically like the back wall, and there was an L on the back of the house,
Right.
like a little shed that they removed and didn't bring with them because it post-dated when the Hawthornes lived there. And there, about a decade ago, I don't know if they're still doing it, but there were some night tours that would tell people that the back fell off the house when we were moving it here, and it's a lie that we try and keep it secret, but it was intentionally moved with the back removed. And you can see it moving on to its current location. That's the same elm tree that sits in front of it today. And so this was done in 1958. A young Abbott Lowell Cummings he was at the time working at Spinea. He helped with the moving of this. I should say that it's a company called B.F. Goodrich and Sons who moved it, and that was actually the year that B.F. Goodrich died. And so it was one of the last houses they moved, and they've been moving houses in Salem since the beginning of the 20th century. And the other ones were moved by the Edwards family, like the Hooper Hathaway house and the Beckett house, who moved a lot of houses, including the John Ward house, which was moved a few blocks to its present location on the Peabody Essex Museum campus.
So, David, going back, it doesn't look like there was a foundation, and you were right, the picture on the right.
Yeah.
Was there a foundation there, or did they do the foundation after the house got there?
You know, I don't know exactly the sequence of events. It does have a concrete foundation.
It has a modern foundation, so I suspect you just can't see it because there's a bunch of walking around it. The cribbing might just be obscuring it, because they'd have to put it down on that framing and then.
I was gonna say, most modern houses in the Northeast have foundations.
Yeah.
It's only when you go in the southern states where you with the clay soil where they don't typically.
Yeah. No, there's a concrete foundation that it sits on, essentially a modern concrete foundation.
Are they moving this on tracks?
The trucks.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay,
So
can I just,
We should take a look
yeah,
at the.
it does look like some tracks there, but this is one of the two. There's two Ford trucks on either end that they use to maneuver it.
Yeah. And I was gonna say, so we kind of cover the breadth of like technologies being moved, and so this is kind of more the more contemporary way of moving it, which is, and there are other options still out there, but pulling it with trucks, putting them on essentially a large steel platform with rollers, wheels that absorb the impact of the path that it goes down, because the rubber wheels are going to be a lot more forgiving than wooden rollers or timber tracks. And yeah, so that kind of brings us to the next one.
Which this is the building we want to talk about the most tonight. This is the humble counting house, which all we know positively about it is in the 1880s it was being used as a garden shed by Henry Upton, who was in that last family who owned the house of the Seven Gables. Their gardens sit right around it. You can see the mansion right there and the Siemens Bethel on its original location. And when the house opened as a museum in 1910, this is a postcard from 1912, and it's small here, but when you look at the full size blown up, you can see the garden door of the House of the Seven Gables very faintly through the window. This is on its original location, and it's interpreted as a captain's counting house. So sort of business office for the shipping trade. There were plenty around. The date on the building is 1830. It's unclear who came up with that date or when or what the justification for it is, but it may be stylistic based on some of the paneling in it. It's hard to say. But it stood there. If that was still there today, you would sort of walk right into the back of it when you walked out of the garden doors into the garden. And so in 1924, when they landscaped the property to accommodate the addition of the retired Beckett house, that got moved to a new location wedged between the mansion and Turner Hall along Turner Street here. So you can see the house, the mansion there, Turner Hall right there, and then right in between them, just along parallel with the street, is the counting house. And then around 1970, it was moved to its current location down by the water, because before that, there was actually a house standing, built at the end of the 19th century, the Reed House, that stood right at the end of Hardy Street. And I believe the records, that house was demolished in the summer of 1966. I suspect that in the aftermath of that fire, they tore that house down as another sort of fire trap, an accident, a tragedy waiting to happen. And then they moved that house away from this really crowded, as they're tearing down Turner Hall, move this away from the mansion so it's less of a fire hazard, and move it to the far corner of the property. And this is where it sits today.
Yes. And so I have this photo here. This was taken by myself, January of 2024. And so this is a sunny day, flooding. There was a storm. Oops, I'm going a little too far ahead. There was a storm, maybe about 100 miles off course, pushing a little bit of a coastal storm surge plus a king tide. But you can see otherwise generally fairly still water coming right up to the top of our seawall. So, you know, we've had interest in kind of understanding how climate change and sea level rise will be impacting our site for a while. Actually, before I get into that, I did want to also just do a quick dive into, we talked a lot about the different reasons about people moving buildings. You know, so before, middle of 1800s, it was primarily economic reasons. Then you get into the sort of period of urban densification and preservation movement, trying to either resist, the oncoming of urban renewal, or just trying to preserve buildings as modern amenities are coming in, other than you have oil. Not oil, coal shipping and everything like that, kind of taking up downtown. So now now we're kind of entering into a period of a different impetus of wanting to move buildings, which is the environmental aspect, climate change, moving, and that's not something that's totally new. So as we kind of consider the counting house, looking at some other aspects, areas where buildings have been moved because of environmental changes. And historically, people tried their best to not put buildings in flood zones, but there is a pretty good exception to that, and that is lighthouses, which were usually put in, bluffs, on sandy bluffs, in order to catch the attention of ships going by. So I brought up this one example, which is Nauset Light, but there are dozens or maybe hundreds of examples of this very type of thing that need to happen, which is lighthouses need to be moved as coastal erosion takes away the
Lighthouses were moved from their original locations all up and down because of technology. The original Nauset Light, I think, was down in Chatham, and it was 2 towers. Before they had the Fresnel lenses of different sizes that rotated them, the way they denote different points was the number of towers.
So in 1923, they moved this one from Chatham. So, so this is Nauset Light. It was originally moved just because of the change in technology, as you mentioned.
So Chatham was originally 2 lights.
Same.
And so this was,
and this was 3 to start.
that came.
But then what happened is that actually those original lighthouses that were in this location, so they were originally built 1838, had to be replaced because the erosion had already made them threatened.
And they're known as the 3 Sisters. And they exist, and they moved back inland.
So it was constant movement of lighthouses having to be brought back away from the coast.
They were all moved on my watch.
Were you part of this 1996
Pardon?
move? Were you part of the move in 1996 of Nauset Light?
Yeah, in '96, I was the regional historical architect.
Wow.
So here we go. I didn't know you would be here today, Bill, but I'm happy. I didn't know you'd be here today, Bill, but I'm happy that.
Yeah, well, I didn't either until my wife told me.
So I wanted to bring in another example. So this is an example of a city that is essentially built in the floodplains of the Mississippi River. I believe it's the Mississippi, but Mason City, Iowa. So they had built berms to protect this city from flooding for 25-year floods over the course of the 20th century. It used to get kind of repeated flooding, nuisance flooding, but then the berms that they built up to protect it kept it better, and so they developed neighborhoods that were more permanent, that were kind of in those floodplains. And then in 2008, they had a major flood, a 100-year flood, that overtopped those berms and flooded out the whole area. And basically the assessment was that this neighborhood shouldn't have been built here, but also it's going to keep flooding worse and worse. We can't build to protect it. So FEMA purchased the properties in the flood area to demolish them. They did a survey of the historic properties, which was required as a federal law. And then they identified 46 eligible properties, 11 individually eligible for National Register listing. So we have this modern house here. This was kind of one of the ticket items done by, I forgot the name of the modern architect, but it was basically deemed, 5 of these houses were the most valuable that needed to be saved. So they moved these 5 buildings into a new block or neighborhood to create a new neighborhood. So there's precedent for this, the flooding that happened in this river, driven by all sorts of things, but climate change was a contributor. So we've been trying to figure out that very same issue for ourselves. I do have a QR code. If you're not familiar, we do have a climate adaptation report that basically plots out essentially the next 50 years. There's cards in the back, but you can also scan this QR code and it'll take you right to the link so you can learn more about it. But essentially we received funding from the state of Massachusetts through the Massachusetts Office of Coastal Zone Management to do a study which took 2 years, lots of exploration. We did mapping of our site with flood maps from Woods Hole Institute. We did boring wells into the ground to basically understand how does groundwater and tide impact on groundwater, what are we seeing in there. Turns out a lot of humidity in our basements. So, so here are some of the flood maps that show this block area is actually the front portion of our site. I would call it the project area of Hooper Hathaway. So this is existing flooding. This is current FEMA flood maps. So this is a VE zone, which basically means velocity. Wave action is anticipated to be part of certain floods. We have an AE zone, which basically means there'll be flooding. It just isn't going to have the velocity of wind and waves. But then we also have projected flooding maps put over our site. So here is our present day estimates, 2030 estimates for flooding, 2050 estimates for flooding, and 2070. So I'm highlighting really the counting house in Hooper Hathaway, but you can take a look and see the impact on our entire site, and you'll see by the time we get to 2070's flooding probabilities, so the blue is basically 100% guaranteed to happen throughout the course of a year. So right now that is kind of what we see, is that we see water lapping up to the top of our seawall, not really totally coming up and over. But then by 2030 and 2050, it's fairly level up there. So once it starts coming over, it'll be coming over with much more regularity, which will be a problem for 2 of our historic buildings still. We do have a phasing plan for this. So it starts off with a phase 1, kind of the most waterfront areas being adapted. But it is basically a coastal relocation plan, where we are a managed relocation plan, where we're going to be moving our buildings further and further away out of the threat. And how fortunate that we had a founder who was so concerned, or previous administrations working here, so concerned about fire, that cleared out so much room for us to move buildings in the future. I say that with a little bit of humor, but obviously there's a lot of change in this neighborhood. The tearing out of sort of that urban fabric has in many ways separated us from the rest of the neighborhood. And as we've done this study, we talk about, we're talking about the process of moving our site uphill away from coastal flooding. It's a sad and difficult prospect, because obviously the location of these buildings is really important, historic, but then there's opportunities. And one of the opportunities we see is the ability to knit ourselves back into the neighborhood. So very roughly, you see that by phase 2, Hooper Hathaway is then also being moved. And these are roughly 10 years for each phase. So counting house being moved first, Hooper Hathaway next, retired Beckett and birthplace on phase 3. Phase 4 is kind of relocate portions of the visitor center, but build a new one that's flood tolerant. And then eventually the possibility of moving the House of Seven Gables itself. That's looking 50 years into the future. We don't know exactly what things are going to look like. I don't know who's even going to be working here then. But the idea is really like, we don't want to get in our own way. We don't want to build a massive new visitor center on the front of Derby Street, say, hey, look at this brand new spanking new building, and then be like, oh, I guess we probably should have saved that space for us to be prepared for coastal flooding and the eventuality that that's going to impact the House of Seven Gables. But bringing us into sort of more present day, we did receive further funding from the Massachusetts Office of Coastal Zone Management, which we're very grateful for, to begin the planning for doing a portion of phase 1, which we're calling phase 1A, to relocate the counting house, install stormwater collection measures, which basically we also have heavier rain that's inundating our basements, trying to keep water away from buildings that is coming coming from rain and groundwater. And then also flood-proofing Hooper Hathaway, because moving that building is going to be no small feat. We better have some flood protections in there while we're figuring that out. But we thought that moving the counting house is a good test case. So here we are. This is its current location. This is its proposed location. This is sort of more just a concept sketch, but it tells you some of the considerations that we made. We're adhering to the National Parks Secretary of Interior standards for flood adaptations. You know, considering we have a building moving tradition, which is great, kind of allows us to move through regulations. We have a bunch of people. We have Mass Historic Commission preservation restrictions. We have Salem Historic Commission preservation restrictions. So everything that we're going to be doing with this is going to be getting the approvals process from outside, historic commission approval. But here we have some of the renderings. I don't want to make sure I'm not missing any of the details over here. Some of the renderings of it in the proposed location. So as you can see, we have this kind of function lawn here. Part of this will eventually get filled in with another building if you're looking at the future phases, but in the meantime, we see an opportunity to have this be sort of an engagement space, can again connect us more to the neighborhood. And here's the current view of it, which, our parking lot, I know, is very heavily utilized by our neighbors. We are not getting rid of all of it entirely. It's actually will be only the reduction of about 9 parking spaces. We did run this by the ZBA. We've been going through permitting channels already, getting approvals, making good progress on that. Here's another view of it. So this would be the entrance path coming through our existing entrance. There'd be 2 opportunities to enter into the site before. Might be a good sort of, before you come on site, take a look at this, figure out what you want to do. Kids get a chance to unwind. We currently use this place primarily as a family kind of engagement area where kids can run around and play with, we have like games in there, rope tying, instruction, things like that. So, we figured this could be a little bit of a good engagement area for kids to kind of burn out maybe a little bit of energy before they come into the visitor center for the So, this is sort of the existing location we're looking at.
Paul, you may have said it, but I may not have heard it, but in the sense of when you're relocating the counting house, or all the buildings that we're proposing to relocate, you're moving it back out of a projected flood zone.
Yes.
Are you changing the elevations as well?
So we are keeping, this is actually having a slight grade change. It's actually going to match because when we built the parking lot, we took down the grade. So it's going to bring it closer to its natural original grade before we paved the parking lot. That's not necessarily because of flood adaptation. We are actually in the parking lot well out of the projected 2070 flooding. Basically, about the middle of the visitor center is where 2070 100-year flood is projected to hit. So, anything on the other side of the visitor center is anticipated to be safe beyond up to 2070. We get beyond that, I don't know what we're going to do. So we gotta work with some sort of benchmark.
Well, the vital issue with relocating buildings is accessibility.
Yes, and that is very much what that is why we are trying we changed the grade, is to make it a more accessible, and let's see if one of these shows that better.
Okay, I'm just trying to...
No. So this is essentially a switchback. So this ramp is a switchback that comes up here. So this will have one step up, but this side will actually be a grade entrance. And we'll actually be putting the building, so we look to do minimal ground disturbance. So we're putting the building on helical piles, which essentially, rather than digging out posts, you drive stakes into the ground and it sets on that. It's more than enough for a shed. So we won't disrupt as much archaeological resources that could be potentially under there. But it also then allows us to kind of set the foundation low. And we'll be kind of building the landscape.
Do these buildings now have full foundations? Or-
The counting house does currently have, it has a block, the counting house has a block foundation, so cement CMU. And it's about 3 feet deep, maybe 4 feet deep. I'd say probably more like 3.
Because one of the things that, the reason I'm just trying to grasp the magnitude is that when PEM re-erected the Chinese house, the architects were good friends of mine, and so I paid attention. One of the things that impressed me was the house was really ground vast, in the sense that it was sitting on the grade, which is typical for a high percentage of our 17th and 18th century houses. One of the things they did that I thought was superb was they put a full depth basement underneath the house to where they could put all of the subsidiary equipment that the buildings nowadays demand.
So because this has very minimal infrastructure, and in fact we actually are looking at powering it potentially entirely with a solar panel, because it's just got a few lights, that's it. You know, there's not much infrastructure there, but you are right, and for the other buildings, we are looking at doing a full foundation to go with those. You know, being a few, decades ahead of us, we don't have those details quite figured out. But this is essentially an accessory building, a shed, a historic shed, one that has very important history to the building. But
it was a shed.
Yeah, it was a shed. But so its foundation is not nearly as important as the other ones will be.
No, I'm just saying it gives you an opportunity to address a lot of
storage
issues. Storage. But no, those are a lot of the peripheral alligators out there, if you may. That complicate. The moving is actually the easiest part.
Yeah. Well, and the digging for foundations might be the difficult part, because we are National Historic Landmark. A National Historic Landmark District, which basically means everything that's part of our district requires archaeological surveying before we can do really any significant digging.
To put that in perspective, the landmark, you got landmark designation, you got National Register. On the landmark list, there's about 3,000 historic sites or buildings on that list. On the National Register, it's over 1 million. So it gives you the idea of how significant this site is with regards to meeting all the pedagogy of preservation.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So I'll just finish with one thing, which is that our plan is to not leave a big hole here. This is the thing. So with the knowledge that potential flooding is going to increase, we know that we're going to be needing something that's more salt tolerant, native landscaping, that's going to be able to recover from flooding. So we have that as part of the plan for our entire site. We're not evacuating these buildings and then building a new parking lot in it. We are making the choice to essentially turn our waterfront into a buffer that may benefit not just us, but our neighborhood as well. So we're looking to inspiration for what the site was before the seawall was built. We're looking at sort of the history of, there was once an ancient way that went through, so we know that the Namkeg, before Salem colonized the place, used this as a path for traveling to fishing destinations. So looking at that, but also just sort of looking at the natural history and the native history on the site. And so that is the plan for the departed location. And that is the end of our presentation.
I want to thank Barbara Warren for helping us to put this together. Everett Philbrook, who's not here tonight, has done a lot of research into the Salem News, and through articles that he's found is how we know a lot about how the retired Beckett House and the Hooper Hathaway House were moved towards that. A lot of those details come from newspaper articles that he's found for us, which is fantastic. So
Yeah.
I want to give him a shout out too.
Yeah.
Yeah.